You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Perhaps no country in Europe can claim to have a long historical ties to the Middle East and North Africa like Italy. Both Italy and the MENA have a strong intertwined history of trade, travel, commerce, diaspora communities, invasions, and cultural exchanges. In recent times, Italy has been at the forefront of the refugee and migration crisis coming out of Libya. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's administration, despite its close ties to Israel, has also been critical of Tel Aviv's war on Gaza and in particular Lebanon. Italy was seeking to normalize relations with Syria during the Bashar al-Assad's regime, which came to an end after the collapse of al-Assad's regime. So what does Rome see as being its interests in the MENA region, and how has it attempted to realize these interests? Joining us to try and answer these questions is Maria Luisa Fantappiè. Fantappiè? So is that how you pronounce your name, sorry?
Fantappiè.
Fantappiè, sorry. This is literally something I do every time I have a guest on. I mispronounce something in their name. It's a little bit of a tradition now. Maria is head of the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern and African program at IAI. She served as special advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva and at the International Crisis Group between 2012 to 2020, engaging at the highest levels of policy in Europe, the United States, and across MENA. This includes Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, Oman, and United Arab Emirates. In 2018, she was seconded by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the European Advisory Mission for Security Sector Reform in Iraq. Her research interests include the MENA region, UAE, EU foreign policy, and great powers competition in the area, conflict prevention and mediation, as well as cultural diplomacy. Maria, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
It is our pleasure to have you. You've got a very interesting, list of interests there, the stuff that you've done. You've done obviously academic research, you've done stuff in diplomacy, but I wonder if we can really start right back at the beginning and start with you, telling us, how did you even get interested in, the MENA region and being involved in foreign policy work?
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation and also answer this quite personal question on how I got involved actually in an interest in the Middle East. And I will say that I'm part of a generation that grew up witnessing the different invasions that took place in the MENA region. So specifically, I was particularly marked by the 2003 US-led invasion. And therefore, starting from there, I became more involved into Middle Eastern studies, living in Damascus, studying Arabic in Damascus, and then really focusing my academic research on Iraq and the political transition after the US-led invasion in Iraq. And then my interest was also that one of applying academic research to conflict prevention. Therefore, I had the opportunity to do so for several years at the International Crisis Group, working on Iraq, conducting fieldwork in different governorates of the country, living in Baghdad, living in the Kurdistan region, and from there also in many other locations, including Lebanon and Turkey, and most recently Jordan. And then obviously from there, I also got an interest into the mediation work. which I could explore at the center of the Humanitarian Dialogue, which is one of the most important mediation centers existing. And there it was also an opportunity to sort of see how politics work beyond actually studying politics and engaging really with policymakers at the highest level and understanding how you could strike actually a deal when conflict happens. So that's my story.
Well, that sounds very interesting, and I think I'm going to pull you up on some of that as we go along because it's going to be very pertinent to what we talk about. But to sort of start with the main question, the first big question that I want to ask, which is about Italy itself. How does Italian policymakers, how do they think about their position in the MENA region, and what do they want, and what sort of informs their sort of approach to it?
Well, this is a very relevant question because Italy started, as you said in your introduction, Italy has a long tradition of cultural but also geographical ties with the surrounding Mediterranean. And there has been for long at the level of the decision making in Rome, the concept of enlarged Mediterranean. Large Mediterranean, it means, is an area which it's not really well defined because it could range from North Africa up to deep into the Middle East. But it's a way for Italian foreign policy making to define the fact that, to state the fact that everything that happens in the different shores of the Mediterranean and also within the in depth within this within the countries that are share the shores of this sea actually affects our domestic politics. And so this has been the concept of enlarged Mediterranean has been the cornerstone of Italian foreign policy making since several decades. Now, the question, I think, today, not only with the current government, but also with previous government, is to understand to what extent actually Italy has a real Middle Eastern policy or it hasn't. So, and my answer is that definitely there is the awareness in different sections of the foreign policy making that, again, everything that happens from North Africa up into the Middle East has an impact on us. But at the same time, I think that there has been still a lot of difficulties to really carve out a clear-cut Middle Eastern politics policy that could define what is the role of Italy when it comes to engaging in the Middle East. Should Italy engage in the Middle East as a part of a larger European strategy? Should Italy instead proceed by doing its policy more on a bilateral basis? So this has been always unresolved questions, which haunts in some way Italian foreign policy making to this day.
So do we see much difference then between the different Italian administrations that come in terms of how they think about what their interests ought to be in MENA region? Or is it just like every administration, they have a vague idea of what they all want? It's pretty similar and also very reactive to events.
I think that specifically with Giorgia Meloni being prime minister, we started to see a specific, distinct way of engaging with in foreign policy in general. So let's also remember that Giorgia Meloni, it's experiment in some way, and it's also important because it's a laboratory of how the right wing can be in power and how it defines its foreign policy. And Giorgia Meloni party, before being in government, had a very ambiguous relationship with how it actually was approaching Europe. And once she became the prime minister, she reassured both the Atlantic Alliance and also European partners in saying and affirming and also in some way implementing policies that were still pointing to the fact that Italy sticks to the multilateral framework of the last decades. And so it sticks to Europe, it sticks to the line of the Atlantic Alliance. However, vis-a-vis of the Middle East, I think that especially with regard with one most important issue that was important for this government, which was migration, this already issue in some way prompted this government to engage and to start a policy that was more on a bilateral basis rather than framed within the broader context of the European policy. And this we saw, for example, with the first steps that Giorgia Meloni took in engaging Kais Saied in Tunisia and actually facilitating an MOU between Europe and Tunisia. But also we saw that continuing also in the context of, for example, her relationship to the Gulf countries most recently. So I think that if we can draw some and define some patterns, we see that Giorgia Meloni administrations prefers to and gives priority to bilateral engagement that can secure Italian national interest, in her opinion, at least in the short term, rather than following a broader context of the European foreign policy making. So that also means taking some initiatives that not necessarily are already taken in Brussels. Her pattern of decision-making has been that one of first engaging bilaterally with counterparts, for example, in North Africa, and then trying to bring in high-level senior European officials, such as President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to bring Europe in afterwards. So in some way, she has defined a different pattern for the way in which Italy engages with the broader, large Mediterranean region.
Does Italy, before we sort of get into Israel-Palestine, which is something I really want to talk about, just in general, when it comes to how different Middle Eastern countries and North African countries see Meloni, do they sort of respond pretty well to her initiatives? Is there a sort of do they sort of see Italy as somebody they can definitely work with? And, you know, what's the relationship like there from the Middle East? How do they sort of see Meloni?
Well, I think that definitely I'm not necessarily the best person to respond to this question, but from my interviews and engagements that I had in so far, I could see that there is definitely a different image that she gives away when it comes to engagement with counterparts in the Middle East. First of all, she is well received in general because she is a seasoned politician that has practiced politics since the very young age in the even more disenfranchised area of the country. So she is able in some way to establish a personal connection with the counterpart, which we know that in the Middle East is something that it's very important in order to strengthen in some way the bilateral ties. And a second element of her policy is that is very welcome, I think, in different capitals of the Middle East and North Africa, is that she is very pragmatic. She looks at results. So in some way, she wants to get things done and she tries to understand where is the space of convergent interest that she can work with when it comes to working with the other side. And also this is this transaction, I will say, approach is something that especially in a post Arab Spring, where also in the Middle East region we saw in some way a rise of semi-authoritarian or authoritarian powers, is is well perceived. Where I think there is more ambiguity, and maybe it's the way in which she does not necessarily engage with other components of the societies in Middle Eastern countries. So, for instance, looking at the case of Tunisia, but we can also see in other cases the dialogue that she can establish also with other components and segments of the societies which might be also critical of the government in place is definitely less than other previous Italian administrations.
Indeed. So now I want to sort of get on to Israel-Palestine. Before we sort of get into what happened over the last year following the 7th of October Hamas attack on Israel and then the Gaza war that followed, I mean, there is this idea that because Israel is governed by a far-right coalition in its own regard, Netanyahu's government is classed as Israel's most far-right government, and that there was going to be some kind of alliance of far-right governments. You know, Hungary obviously is the most obvious example with Viktor Orban, and you know, many others. And when Italy sort of has now a far-right government, how do they sort of have a kind of special connection with Israel, special bond with Israel because of this far-right connections, or is it, you know, as you say, pragmatic as with other countries?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because at first glance we could state that there has been, yes, a general trend of conservative politics that has engulfed Europe and which also Middle Eastern countries, in particularly Israel, could sync better than with the center-left governments. In some way, we can see that there is elements of shared elements in the policies of these governments. The fact that, for instance, there is maybe more focus on the national interest, even over multilateral frameworks. There is a priority that is given to the there is a general disregard, I think, for human rights and civil society issues, as I was saying before, and also in domestic politics, always, for example, a recurrent criticism of the judiciary, which is something very relevant now, for instance, also for Israel. And last but not least, I think there is also an element which is shared, which is the shrinking freedom of press and freedom of expression that we saw across this different type of government. But despite there are similarities, I think, in the way in which this new global right, if we could say that, is defining itself in power, I think when it comes to foreign policy, then each single state defines also its own interests. So in that sense, I believe that the ideological proximity that there could be between the right-wing government in Israel and the right-wing government in Italy does not necessarily imply and means an alignment on all the issues, especially when the interests of Israel and the interests of Europe or Italy are conflicting.
So in that sense, it is still very much national interest above party ideology in that sense.
I do think so, because still, like, one of the main characteristics of this right-wing government in power is that the priority goes to answering their constituency inside their own domestic politics, keeping shore up their domestic coalition, and that has the priority over everything else. And sometimes when you are not able to do that by aligning with someone who is like-minded in another country, you prioritize your own, the continuity of your own power within your own country over the ideological proximity that you might have with other leaders in the world.
Yes, and this is an interesting area because when we think about Israel's war in Gaza now, this was obviously a very difficult time for a lot of countries around the world. And it also was difficult for many European countries because on the one hand, especially the first few weeks after October 7th, the line coming out of Washington was there is no there's no red lines as far as Biden, when he was president, as far as he was concerned when it came to what Israel could do in Gaza. But within Europe, you always felt there was sort of at the civil society level, definitely they wanted to see this war brought to an end very soon. And within governments, there was a relative unease about how far Israel might go. And as the war went on, the bigger that unease became, because when we look at even Britain, which tends to go with whatever America does, at least in terms of what they do publicly, you started to see the suspension of certain new arms licenses, and you see the UK dropping subjection to the ICC court investigation into Netanyahu, and also Spain and Belgium. They follow a different policy where they were vocally opposed to the war in Gaza. But with Italy, what we sort of see is that, of course, there is the solidarity with Israel after the 7th of October attack. But we do sort of see later on Meloni criticizing certain things, such as, particularly when the attack happened on Lebanon, an attack on Lebanese peacekeepers in Lebanon, not Lebanese peacekeepers. And so how would you sort of say the Italian relationship to Israel was during this period?
I think that it's that at the very start, so first of all, there has been a genesis of that relationship since the 7th of October up until now. In the immediate aftermath of the 7th of October, I think that there was a very clear, full-fledged solidarity with Israel, even at the level of the Italian society, I will say. So that was like an uncomplicated position, I think, for the Meloni government to take. I think that then we started a second phase once the IDF offensive on Gaza began. And I will say that at the very beginning of the offensive, when it was not clear exactly the level of devastation that this would bring, still there was, from the Meloni government side and also from the different ministers of her government, a general support for the national security of Israel to be at the forefront, even to take priority over, for instance, international humanitarian law. So, and I think that this line was kept this way up until the moment when the destruction of Gaza and the humanitarian crisis and the toll of death reached really a level that was also placing the government in a difficult position. So at some point there has been from the Ministry of Defense also some declaration, Guido Crosetto, that actually pointed to the fact that there will be some that we need to rethink in some way this relationship, and that and also the Minister of Foreign Affairs Tajani stated several times throughout last year the support that Italy has for the two-state solution. So in some way, we see that in this difficult quagmire, Meloni sort of retreated from the scene. It was not exactly clear what her position vis-a-vis of Israel was, and I think that this was what we call a strategic ambiguity. It was very difficult for her to take an outward stand against what was happening, but at the same time, she also somehow delegated to the U.S. administration and to the negotiators of hostages and to those who were negotiating the ceasefires a hopeful end to this conflict. Things once again turn with the war in Lebanon, because when there was an attack on the UNIFIL contingent, where as we know, Italy is a contributor to the UNIFIL, then again the sort of domestic interest kicked in, because at that point she, I think, Prime Minister could not do other than criticizing what was happening, precisely because Italy was a contributor to the UNIFIL. And I think also by September this year, we see that once the conflict has been enlarging to such an extent within the region, then also there has been more discussion also within Italian newspapers, in Italian talk shows, that pointed to the fact that the continuation of Israel military strategy could also affect our own stability. So her position of support towards Israel became milder, I will say.
So she went milder partly because of pressure coming from within her own society. But when they say stability or effects of stability, what did they mean by that?
Well, I think that first of all, there is a fresh memory among Italian policymakers, but also within society, on how the Syrian conflict, for instance, in the last decade, had also generated a wave of migrants that not only had an effect on, had also an effect on Europe domestic politics, and so once the war, up until the time the war was restrained within the Gaza Strip, somehow the calculus was very cynical, and despite there was a blatant violation of international humanitarian law, the Italian government was not so outspoken about it. But then I think when the war also started to expand to other countries, neighboring countries that are generally very important for Italy stability, for example, Lebanon, because we always, in Italy, there has been always a discussion about the potential collapse of the Lebanese state and the Lebanese economy, and the shockwaves effect of migrants that this would imply. Then I think that this created a new dynamic that made also to reconsider how much Italy wanted to overtly support Israel national security interests. And I think that the main interest here became that one of ending and containing the war, rather than that one of giving no red line to Israeli decision making over continuation of the war.
So when we talk of support here and trying to sort of curtail it a little bit later, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about moral and diplomatic support? Are we talking about arms supplies? What are we talking about in terms of support?
You mean the support to
Israel?
Well, okay. I mostly refer to diplomatic support. Also, we saw that we didn't mention before, but during the first year, there has been many Junga votes where Italy took either it abstains. So it signals in some way that it cared about Israel national security, and it gave indirect support to it. So I'm mostly talking about diplomatic support. Also, another element is that unlike other countries, like, for example, Spain or other EU member states who have recognized the state of Palestine, Italy maintained this position where they stated support for the two-state solution, but they didn't actually arrive to recognize Palestine. So the line was always that one, also within the EU Council, of supporting humanitarian truce, but it was never reaching the point of supporting the recognition of Palestine as other EU member states had done. And last but not least, I will say that the conversation and the dialogue with Israeli diplomats here in Rome has been always ongoing between Israeli officials and Italian authorities, and it has never actually stopped. What I think was a missed opportunity from Italy was that one of not working, I think, enough on engaging with Arab states that actually could have been a key to the solutions, like some of the Gulf states, to be more present into the diplomatic scene on how to put an end to this conflict. As I said, I think that there was a sort of strategic ambiguity, a withdrawal from the scene during the past year, and this in some way didn't cast. Italy didn't have a role like, for example, Norway had in trying really to engage into an end of this conflict. It rather withdrew from the scene, maybe thinking that this was a too difficult conflict to handle, and it was better to stay a little bit far and delegate to the United States rather than engaging directly, taking a stand either on one side or on another.
Do you think that cost Italy in any way by not being a more active player?
Well, I think it was actually an Israeli colleague who told me that once that Italy is not a player in the Middle East, and I think it's true. Italy, again, as I said before, Italy has awareness about the strategic relevance that the Middle East has for its own stability, and its potential also economic opportunities. But it really did not develop yet a strategy, I think, on how to engage. So in some way, there was, yes, a cost. But the counter-argument to this could be to say that engaging too overtly could have casted Italy on one side of the conflict, and in some way also lifted some card that now, as the conflict is unfolding, Meloni, for instance, could use. You could see this in two ways, and it's difficult to evaluate because the conflict has yet to come to an end.
Indeed. And so is there then no engagement with, say, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah? I mean, obviously not Hamas in Gaza, but is there any sort of connection to the PA?
The official position of the Italian government is to support the Palestinian Authority, and this has been the official line. I'm not sure, however, how much, for example, I didn't see beyond a diplomatic statement of support to the Palestinian Authority any engagement on, for example, rethinking the so-called renewal of the Palestinian leadership, or an active engagement, for example, on rethinking and supporting the plan of reconstruction that Arab states have put forward for Gaza, at least as we speak. It might be that, especially after Meloni visit to Saudi Arabia, which took place in January, and depending on how her special relationship with Trump will unfold, that she could actually take a more protagonist role into the unfolding geopolitical dynamics of this region. But insofar, we haven't seen anything of that.
Indeed. And I wonder then, now moving on to Syria, because when we sort of look at, what has been happening in Syria for the last 15 years, we've had the European Union generally, European countries have taken a certain stance, although, inter-politics within Europe has, especially in the last 5-6 years, there's always discussion of, should we normalize with Assad? Should we return the refugees? Is it safe to go back? That's the sort of thing we've seen in the last few years, obviously before Bashar al-Assad fell on the 8th of December 2024. And Italy, in fact, sent out diplomats to Syria, late last year before the fall of the regime. So what was the sort of thinking there? What were they hoping to achieve with doing that before we sort of get on to what it is now?
Well, back then, when there was a decision to send a chargé d'affaires to Damascus, this was not a novelty, at least for us Italian, because for people who have actually followed the course of Italy-Damascus relationship over the past 10 years, we saw that Italy has always had an ambiguous relationship to the Bashar al-Assad regime, in the sense that it was always there was a special envoy who was very active in also visiting the capital, Damascus, And I think that there has been constantly this inclination of thinking that it was better to engage with Damascus since the regime was going to stay, rather than just trying to think that this regime one day will fall, and therefore it was better to be the first one to engage among the European states, or at least to gather a coalition of European states that was more inclined to engage, rather than being not do so. And I think that this also stemmed from the fact that Italy thought that the 2017 European strategy vis-à-vis of Syria was outdated, and to that extent, I think they were right that this strategy needed to be thought again. But nobody, neither Rome, I think, could foresee that the regime would fall. So that decision, in a nutshell, was taken out of trying. I think, it was taken in line with a genesis of continued relationship that Italy had with the authorities in Damascus, even after the revolution, and also out of the spirit of initiative, of thinking of being first before other European states, and trying also to influence other European states in rethinking the 2017 European strategy vis-à-vis of Syria. Obviously, then the unexpected happened, and I think that what we see in the last 2 months is 2 months and a half, more than 2 months, is an attempt to redirect the engagement towards the new authorities, which, by the way, once again, somehow confirms this idea of that Italy is not that it was particularly particularly inclined towards engaging the Bashar al-Assad regime, but wanted to have a relationship with Damascus. And in some way, the calculus is the same. We want to have a relationship with the authorities in Damascus, whomever they are.
So when sort of going back to the meeting, do we know sort of what happened in those meetings? Do we know what what conversations were had, and what, when the special envoy went out to Damascus and met with Bashar al-Assad and his regimes, do we sort of know what kind of discussions they were actually having?
No, actually, we don't know what type of level the special envoy was engaging within with the Syrian counterpart. So we have to be careful here to state that there was a relationship with the authorities, but there was also a statement from the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs that the return of the chargé d'affaires to Damascus will not mean normalization. The fact that they would have then proceeded in that direction, we don't know. It might have been, but there was no intention at the very start to actually give, be accredited by Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. So most of the work of the special envoy prior December 8th was mostly focusing on soft area, cultural heritage, things that, issues where issues where and sectors where there was not also, that were not also hit by sanctions. So it was a very gradual approach, and we don't know what would have happened if Bashar al-Assad would have stayed in power.
So now moving forward with Ahmed al-Shara now in charge in Damascus, and there's also, obviously Syria, one of the big things it wants is sanction relief, which we see a lot of different European foreign ministers going out to Damascus. They say they will say things like, yes, we would consider that, but obviously we want to see you do X, Y, or Z first, create an inclusive government or whatever it is. Where does how is Italy sort of seeing the new administration, and what does it think its interests now might be? Obviously we've got issues with things like refugees and migration, which is still a big issue within Europe, but there's also other things, I'd imagine economic issues and other stuff. So how does Italy see it?
Italy's position vis-à-vis of the new authorities in Damascus has been that one of trying to follow the pace of other European states. So sit with the new authority, try to see what type of sectorial I think supporting also the relief of some sectorial sanctions on specific sectors. I think that, however, the commitment to a inclusive political process has been milder than that one of other European countries. In some way, the policies that was applying before the fall of Bashar al-Assad, it also applies now, of saying we engage with, reporting, the thinking of the Italian policymakers. I think that the thinking is the same. We engage with whomever is there, and we cannot expect that, especially after the failures that the West has had in trying to bring democratic systems in the Middle East, we cannot expect that actually we will be the one who are going to force or enforce or encourage such a processes. On this, I think that in some way, despite this first argument could make sense considering the legacy of destruction that for instance, US-led invasion has had on Iraq, it makes sense. But at the same time, we also have to understand, I think, that that there is there are components within the Syrian societies who have been part of the opposition, who are not armed, and who have been resisting in a different way, not with arms, not with weapons, but with constant engagement, living in exile, and I think it will be a tremendous mistake actually to neglect those components, because those components are also skilled human beings who can really be assets in rebuilding a stable Syria. Last but not least, I think that there is the sort of decentralization matrix that needs to be still defined in Syria, and then we know that there are other components, not only, in Europe we speak a lot about the minority, but I will say it's not just an issue about the minorities, it's an issue on what type of state structures Syria will have, what type of powers the governorates will have, and what type of powers the central government will have. Definitely the decision on this crucial issue, it's really in some way it will determine Syria's stability for the next decades. So it's in the interest of Italy and any European country, I believe, to ensure that that discussion is not only, and that decision is not only taken within a small group of opposition leader or former opposition leader who have now become the ruler, but is a broader discussion which engages other component of the opposition who have been not siding with the Bashar al-Assad regime, and therefore it's in the benefit of Europe and Italy to encourage the most open and inclusive discussion on those issues. Let's not forget that the lesson that we have from Iraq and from other contexts of post-conflict and post-authoritarian transition is that the first year after a regime falls is the most important, where the sort of structures of polity shapes up. And once you get that wrong, then, you sort of set into motion a continuous return to conflict. So it's in our interest to have an inclusive transition. So I think that more attention to those other components, to have an inclusive transition beyond just, recognizing the new authorities as the new leaders of the country, it's a must.
Indeed. And now I want to sort of move to Libya, because this is actually a very big issue for Italy, because of course, when we specifically, if you think about the impact of instability has had on Libya and the sort of migration crisis it came out of it, Italy is obviously a key place where a lot of migrants arrive from Libya. And there's always been a lot of tension over what happens in Libya, not just between Italy and Libya, but between Italy and other European countries who officially take one stance, but the French being the most obvious case, backing other sides as well. So how does, what does Italy see as its core interests within Libya to be?
Well, first of all, it's important to state that the migration crisis, at least in the past years, has been actually stemming not from Libyan, but from Tunisia, which has been the bottleneck of migrants' departure. And in 2022, we have seen a huge peak of migrants coming not only from Libya but also from the Sahel routes, and Tunisia has become the new bottleneck of migration. So the policy, I think that the core interest of Italy in general in North Africa is to find a reliable counterpart with whom to sit and speak, and I think that this there is a sense of fatigue in Rome, especially in contexts like Libya, where there is divisions at the level of the leadership, on trying to understand how to secure that. That is why, when it comes to Kais Saied, despite his authoritarian practices, Kais Saied has become a main counterpart for the Meloni government to sit and actually strike agreements that also include containment of departure and more patrolling of illegal migration flows. So again, like the priority is that one of trying to have a stable counterpart, but sometimes also at the cost of anything, even at the cost of the democraticness of and the democratic processes that are in place in the North African states.
Yes, indeed. And I think in the case of Tunisia, it seems like Italy's policies seem very similar to other European countries, France most notably, since it's one of the big players there. And indeed, I think one of the issues from what I can see is that when it comes to the sort of North African region, there is a sort of, France wants to be the leader of the Mediterranean. It has that Mediterranean summit, and you also have Spain that gets involved in certain areas, Morocco, the issues there. And so there's also a potential for a lot of conflict, and has been potential for conflict between these European powers when dealing with North Africa. I think in the case of Libya, for example, you have obviously the General National Unity Government, which was formed after the collapse of Gaddafi in 2011 to 2012. And then after the sort of Khalid al-Haftar split from the GNU in 2014, you saw certain European countries backing GNU, and you saw the French effectively backing Haftar, although secretly, and a cobbling together of complex alliances, partly because also the US chose to take a bit of a back seat to all of this as well. So how did sort of Rome back then manage the sort of conflicts, not just within the North Africa region, but conflicts with other European states over their policies?
Well, on that, there has been within this Giorgia Meloni government has tried, first of all, to shape a new narrative on how to engage North African state. There has been 1 year, 1 year and a half, last January actually, the launch of a plan for engagement with Africa, which is called the Mattei Plan. And this plan, it tries to also shape a new mode of engagement with counterparts that is not necessarily based on, for example, security issue like fighting jihadism, like for example for the French was for like in certain Sahelian states, but is more based on like a private sector partnership between Italy and North African states, also migration deals, despite the plan, the Mattei plan does not necessarily mention this, but the Mattei plan has 8 pilot countries, including North African country and some African countries, where really tries to have a new method of engagement. And this idea of launching a plan, which is still, we don't know how successful it will be, it was really, I think, done in relation to what you were mentioning before, in relation to try to shape different pathways for Italy to define its policy vis-a-vis of other European countries' policy, in particularly France. So there is not only, not only there has been a fracture between Italy and France over Libya, but that fracture, I think, has been even deepened, and especially more recently, when Italy tries to gain a prominent role in North Africa and in Africa, with the Prime Minister, who is in some capitals, she appears in a way a more friendly counterpart maybe than France could be. But once again, I mean, the Mattei plan is still an experiment, and I think that we saw that definitely France way of engagement with the North African states, especially in the Sahel, was a failure. But that does not necessarily mean that Italy way of engaging will be a success, also because the Mattei plan lacks one important component, which is that one of engaging Europe in Italy new policy towards Africa. So this is still a national plan that Italy has launched. It's true that it has opened to other European countries to contribute to the plan, and in some cases you have a partnership with other European countries, in specific country, over clean energy, over trade. But still, it cannot be said that the Mattei plan that Giorgia Meloni has launched has become the new, has been able to define the European way of engaging with Africa. So we are still very far from that. Until now, the Mattei plan and Italy line, it's some way a narrative that is convincing, but still we have yet to see if it will deliver really results.
So I want to sort of ask here then, if you were, for example, somebody advising the Italian government about what you think the future challenges in the MENA region are going to be and how Italy should meet that, what would you say to them? What do you think they're sort of missing, and what do you think they could do more of?
One word is a strategy, and that's what I said before. You cannot speak about enlarged Mediterranean without knowing where you place yourself in the regional power competition, and most importantly in the global power competition. But this is even more difficult now, where the global alliances are changing. So, I could see different scenarios. If Giorgia Meloni's government decides to give priority to a special relationship with the Trump administration, she could in some way lever on that to play a role also of bridge, especially, for example, in situations where also in relation to the stability in the Middle East, for example, in relation to a negotiation over the new nuclear deal with Iran, or in relation to continuation of Iran-Saudi Arabia dialogue, or for instance, in relation to a potential future normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. All these are sort of gaps in which Italy could potentially play a role, or could play a role, and with itself also could bring a European role. However, especially after the shock of the transatlantic relationship that we have seen during the past week, I think it's very difficult to understand whether Giorgia Meloni will give a priority to her special relationship to Trump or to her role within Europe, because or to European unity and European strategic autonomy. Obviously, if we go down the path of European strategic autonomy, it's France who has the lead more than Italy. However, it's true that she has this card that maybe nobody in Europe has, which is maybe the fact that she can call and Washington, and maybe Trump can pick the phone. So when it comes to Middle Eastern affairs, as we saw, for example, with the liberation of the journalist, the Italian journalist who was held in Iran, and how she has managed this liberation to get a release in a very short time frame, I think this is a case study to see that how, in some way, her special relationship to Washington could be leveraged also for Italy to be defining a role in unresolved geopolitical issues in the Middle East. But as I said, we are in a very fluid moment, so we don't know exactly if that how much Meloni she could actually use that special relationship. And I think that the second element maybe is more certain is the fact of trying, I think, to continue to engage as much as possible Gulf states, because Gulf states, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and on that Meloni has been quite successful, will be anyway an important piece of the puzzle in Middle Eastern future stability, both vis-a-vis of the normalization with Israel, but also both vis-a-vis of the containment of Iran military and nuclear ambition. So I think that on that she should and she could, I think, be at the forefront of the scene, considering also that she has established a good relationship both with the Emirates and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
Maria, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversation.
Thank you so much. I hope it was, I didn't speak too long.
No, you were perfect. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this one or previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.